Thanks for all coming on such a hot day, and I'm really particularly happy we managed to get to air conditioning. So I actually got the century wrong, and I realised that only just now. Between 1609 and 1610, I think that's correct, Galileo made a series of observations with a telescope of his own design that he took to be evidence for the existence of a range of celestial phenomena. These included craters on the moon, the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and sunspots. At the time, it's been pointed out by various people that Galileo had a somewhat weak understanding of the functioning of the telescope, and moreover, very little understanding of the background kind of science behind the successful operation of the telescope for celestial observation, particularly the effects of atmospheric aberration were almost entirely understudied at that point. And a kind of standard thing you find in the epistemology of experiment is the claim that a properly calibrated instrument whose functioning is well understood for the purpose at hand is necessary for credible presentation of observational experimental results, which seems to give a slightly jarring conclusion that Galileo was unjustified in taking his telescopic observations to provide evidence for the existence of phenomena such as the phases of Venus and the satellites of Jupiter. So we have this strange disconnect between the kind of norms of evidence in philosophy of experimental science and cases such as Galileo in the history of science where those norms don't seem to have been met. And this paper is really an attempt to respond to this challenge in a particular kind of quantitative framework and to look at some other case examples. We'll go back to the case of Galileo, and I'll kind of give you some qualitative remarks that were made by the historian and scientist and philosopher Alan Franklin that was the kind of jumping off point for this paper. We'll then present a kind of formal analysis of the situation to understand the extent to which we can take Galileo's justification situation to be a successful one. I'll then narrate two further examples from the history of physics, both from late 19th century electromagnetism, one in which the kind of situation mirrors the Galileo case and one in which it doesn't. And then Samir will take over and give you two examples from the history of biology before we draw some kind of more general conclusions. So let's go back to the case of Galileo first. One of the things that you read a lot, and I possibly said myself in the undergraduate introductory philosophy of science lecture at some point, is, oh, well, of course, Galileo didn't know that the telescope worked well celestially, and of course he didn't fully understand its operation, but he could calibrate it terrestrially. I mean, think about the simplest example. He can look at a tower and see an image of a tower, and then he can physically go to the tower and see that the two images match. And it seems like that could be the kind of justification he might have had available. And I'm usually not particularly positive about Feyerabend, but in this case, he had a good point. So Feyerabend, in his discussion, severely criticizes this kind of reasoning. In fact, exactly what was in question was whether, like, reliability, I can't pronounce that, being reliable terrestrially can be transferred to the celestial realm. And people actually in informal epistemology have claimed that it's somehow epistemically problematic to say that a telescope could work terrestrially but not work celestially. But that's exactly the central claim of Aristotelian physics, is that things are different beyond the moon. And so it really is quite clear that transferring your justification from being able to use it on the Earth to beyond the moon is really not kind of coherent at this stage. And it's not clear that Galileo gives this argument anyway. So failing that, is there any other means of justification he could give? He doesn't really have a theory of the atmosphere. You can't use terrestrial justification. Does that mean we just have to say Galileo was unjustified? That's certainly what Feyerabend thinks, right? Feyerabend thinks ultimately it's anarchy, and Galileo was just a kind of skillful opportunist who could trick people into believing this stuff, and that's what science should be like. What's the alternative? I think that the crucial move is to think about the structure of the different observations that Galileo made. And some of them, at least, there is a justificatory structure living within the observations. And the moons of Jupiter are the classic examples which we're taking from Alan Franklin. So if we think about the moons of Jupiter, and think about Galileo's successive observations of them, I mean, his book that he published in 1610, which I can't pronounce because it's in Latin, I think 2/3 of it is about detailing these observations. So it's really important for him. He detailed the observations of the moons of Jupiter, which he named after the Medicis, across huge parts of the book, which is probably also why it was so much of the book. He's trying to carry favour with them. So what's special about this observation? Why is it different to some of the others? Well, think about what it would mean for there to be something going wrong with the telescope. So it's certainly possible that a telescope that's malfunctioning can produce aberrant spots of light that could be taken to be a celestial body. But it's extremely unlikely that a kind of spot of light that's produced by an experimental artifact would follow an orbital pattern. And it's even less likely, it's basically impossible, completely implausible, that artifactual images would resemble ellipses and other phenomena that you'd see in a planetary system or small planetary system like moons. And so what you find if you look at the historical reconstructions of these cases, or the historical discussion of the history of this case in the contemporary literature, is that you do find early modern astronomers reasoning this way, that it's completely implausible that the moons could be artifacts because of the way that they appeared and the way that they kind of encoded regular orbital structure. The reason that satellites seen around Jupiter were unlikely to be telescopic artifacts, because such artifacts would have stable appearance rather than exhibiting orbital motion. And even, in fact, some of the Jesuit astronomers who are severely criticizing Galileo and disagree with his heliocentrism endorse this kind of reasoning. And no one serious who used the telescope consistently and persistently doubted the observation of the moons of Jupiter. And so this kind of way that we've labeled this phenomena artifact asymmetry, this is our kind of label for want of a better term. But the actual pattern that we're talking about has been kind of recognized earlier. So we'll just use artifact asymmetry to really mean in general there being a situation where a scientist has reason to believe that false positives are highly suppressed relative to true positives, even in the case where the apparatus is not functioning fully reliably. So it's a very general claim about the epistemic status for scientists, which is about the ratio of true positives to false positives in the case where the experiment is not, or the apparatus is not functioning fully reliably. And the claim is that in such an epistemic situation that we take Galileo to be in respect to the moons of Jupiter, the scientists can gain evidence for the existence of the phenomena based upon a positive observational report made using the apparatus, even if they don't know that their apparatus is functioning fully reliably. So the claim is that there is this kind of situation that's encoded in this ratio between subjective degrees of belief, and in that situation, they can gain evidence in this slightly, perhaps surprising way. And so, as I said before, the idea is not ours. It appears in at least 6 or 7 publications informally by Alan Franklin. What he also claims, which is perhaps even more counterintuitive, is that in a situation, as we described, the situation we call artifact asymmetry, you can also gain evidence that the apparatus is functioning reliably. So you can increase your subjective degree of belief both in the original observation and in the reliability of the apparatus when you have this particular scenario, such as the moons of Jupiter. So Galileo didn't just learn that it's very, very likely that Jupiter has moons, he learned it's very likely, or more likely, that the telescope is functioning reliably. And what we want to do is formalize these claims using Bayesian confirmation theory. And ultimately what we find is that the first claim is valid in general. as long as the condition on the ratio between these conditional probabilities is as assumed, you can show that you get confirmation of the observational report, strong confirmation. And then we show that Franklin's claim regarding the confirmation of the reliability of the apparatus is true at least in a particular parameter regime, which we will define shortly. So his informal claim is at least partly vindicated for me. So how would we go about doing such an analysis? The obvious thing to do is go to the LSE circa 2002 and see what Bovens and Hartmann would do. So in a paper and a book, Bovens and Hartmann produced a whole array of models for Bayesian confirmation for experimental situations, and they characterize this as the problem of unreliable instruments. They have a really kind of complex machinery where you're looking at different instantiations of instruments and lots of different scenarios. But their basic kind of initial model has the form of this kind of Bayesian network. And we think that there are four propositions. The theory is empirically adequate, which is the T up here. The phenomena exists. There's a positive observational report in the experiment. It's kind of correlated to the phenomena, and the apparatus is fully reliable. There's ways in which you want to de-idealize this, but there's a useful kind of starting point for how to represent the situation of a kind of canonical experiment. And this is, we've slightly changed the wording, but this is essentially us just reporting their model. I'll tell you how we're going to modify it shortly. So the first thing you would do is what it means for the apparatus to be reliable and the phenomena to exist is that the conditional probability of the observation given the phenomena exists and the apparatus is reliable is 1. Similarly, if the phenomena doesn't exist and the apparatus is reliable, conditional probability will be 0. We'll talk about one way of de-idealizing this by introducing statistical noise at the end, although I won't go into full detail. And then they have this further assumption, which they call randomization, which I've written out in 3 lines just because we're going to unpack it slightly differently to them. And for this, they just assume that the they call it randomizer, not randomization. They say their model assumes that the conditional probabilities of the observational report, given the phenomena and the non-full reliability of the apparatus, is some number between 0 and 1, excluding 0 and 1. And they assume that this is symmetric between the case where the phenomena exists and the case doesn't exist. So they assume A and B between 0 and 1, not including 0 and 1, and they assume A equals B. And essentially what our kind of key move is to not make this assumption and actually make an assumption regarding the relative size of these. But before we get to our assumption, we'll kind of go back again, travel back in time even earlier to the kind of 80s and 90s, where there was a particular issue that lots of people wrote about, most kind of interestingly, perhaps Shimini and Ehrman, and there's lots of other discussions, really nice recent discussions as well, which is called the catch-all problem. And essentially, it's a possible objection to the framework I just described that we're going to use throughout. Because you might think that, in fact, these conditional probabilities, the way that they've been written, involving the negation of V, because they may just be completely indeterminate. The scientists might have no way of assessing conditional probabilities of the observation given the phenomena and non-fully reliability, or the observation and not the phenomena and non-fully reliability. Because there's an indefinite number of ways that something can be not fully reliable. So the not V is actually a kind of catch-all that includes a possibly very long disjunction of propositions regarding ways in which the instrument cannot be fully reliable, many of which we might not even have kind of subjective knowledge about. So we think this is an interesting problem, but not really too much of a worry for us, because we really aren't concerned with the issue about whether or not these can be constrained to point values, so long as we can constrain the relationship between them. And you can show, in fact, that so long as they're probabilistically independent, and the apparatus hasn't been kind of engineered to fool us, we'll always expect at least the A to be bigger than the B, even if we can't produce point estimates of A. So we'd always expect, the worst case scenario almost would be that these are very, very close, but we'd always expect A to be bigger than B. Right, so then if we go back to the kind of problem of encoding the artifact asymmetry analysis of scientific case studies formally, what we can then do is just take the Bovens and Hartmann structure, and then rather than having the assumption that A equals B, we encode the artifact asymmetry and an inequality between A and B, that A is much greater than B. And importantly, this can obtain even if A and B are both very small. So really, OP and V and their negation are all just assumed to be neither 0 or 1, just like in Bovens and Hartmann. It's a very trivial assumption. 2 and 3 are the same as Bovens and Hartmann again, and they're just encoding what it means to be a fully reliable apparatus. Again, there's a way that you can relax this by introducing some kind of statistical noise, which we'll talk about in a second. And then 4 to 6, these conditions, which are the artifact asymmetry conditions, or the kind of the core of them, core difference with Bovens and Hartmann, they really just say that the probability of positive observation given the existence of phenomena and a less than fully reliable apparatus is much greater than probability of a positive observation given the non-existence of the phenomena and a less than fully reliable apparatus, which is just a generalization of the claim regarding Galileo's telescope and the moons of Jupiter. And like I said, we'll talk about at least 3 other cases where these conditions seem to obtain in different areas of science later. At this point, we could think also whether this is a descriptive or a normative claim. At the very least, scientists at certain points in the history of science seem to have had these beliefs. And then the final condition is just that these conditional probabilities are, again, not 0 or 1. So, what can we then show? It's fairly straightforward then to prove that in general you'll have the confirmation of O by P is strong. P of O given P is much greater than P of O not P. That's really the core of Franklin's intuition that you can learn a lot by seeing the moons of Jupiter. It's very likely that the moons of Jupiter exist because of this structure. If you further assume that P and V are probabilistically independent, you can then prove that the confirmation, not strong confirmation, just confirmation of O by V is equivalent to this inequality, which, as I'll show you once you put some numbers in, so long as the prior of A isn't too big, will generally be satisfied. You can then also just derive the Bayes factor, which will be useful for thinking about the behavior of the confirmation measure for very large, for different kind of extreme regimes of V. And again, I'll show you a graph in a second. So, to say what I already said, R1 tells us when artifact asymmetry conditions obtain, so long as P, O, and V have non-trivial priors, positive observation will strongly confirm the existence of phenomena. This vindicates the intuition that Galileo's telescopic observations did provide strong evidence for existence of Jupiter's moons, despite Galileo's limited information about the reliability of his telescope and the astrophysics. So it justifies both Franklin's interpretation of this case and, to be honest, Galileo and his contemporaries' interpretation of the case as well. Contra fire up, I'd say. R2 then tells us that when the artifact asymmetry conditions obtain, O will confirm V so long as P is not too small, the prior of P is not too small. It's P, not V. I got confused. This vindicates Franklin's claim about the dual role of the telescopic observation that provide evidence of the existence of Jupiter's moons and the reliability of the telescope at the same time. And these are conditions under which the Franklin claim is true. And so this would be the we just plug in some numbers for the value of A. We find that so long as the prior of P is above this line, then we also get the confirmation of V. Right? And so there's a large parameter space in which we'll also confirm V. But again, the confirmation, the magnitude of confirmation may be small because we've only shown confirmation, but not a strong confirmation. And it's very unlikely that A will be very, very high. So it's actually quite robust space. And then the third result tells us that we can basically look at the extreme behavior of look at the behavior of the Bayes factor under extreme behavior of V and see the effect of the asymmetry. But if the prior probability V is very low, the Bayes factor is dominated by so you have weak confidence the apparatus is fully reliable. The Bayes factor is dominated by the ratio of A to B. Whereas if the Bayes factor is very high, if the prior of V is very high, the Bayes factor gets really strongly amplified and kind of diverges. And the ratio of A to B stops really having an appreciable effect. So in a sense, the kind of relevance of artifact asymmetry gets kind of controlled by the prior of V. So long as the prior of V is not too high, the Bayes factor will be strongly amplified, even in a region where A and B are both very small. But this doesn't hold true for the converse. The negative Bayes factor is independent of the ratio A and B when A and B. So there's different behaviors, you can look at the regions in which this effect is going to be amplified. And particularly if you look at this figure, what you can see is that we fix where B is for low prior of V, the ratio of A to B is having a large effect on the Bayes factor, but for high prior of V, it's basically you're going to get no difference at all. And so one implication of this is in the context of modern high precision experiment, when the prior of V is very high, these effects probably aren't going to be useful. So the fact that all of our examples are in context of all of our positive examples are in context of experimentation in slightly early phases of a particular experimental tradition, where it seems it's more important, or these things can become more important. It might not perhaps solve problems in the LHC physics or something where your prior of V is it's just not going to really add much to the overall motion. How am I doing for time? I feel like I've been talking too long.
Just 30 minutes. Just 30 minutes.
3-0. Oh yeah, I should speed up. As I said, you can extend all this following Osimani and Landes. You can add in random error to the Bovens and Hartmann model, which they do in general. We're doing just for a case. And then you can prove kind of analogs of our results. If you're interested, the paper is actually on the archive, and I put the archive number up here, and you can have a look at the kind of more general results. Let's go back to do some physics, though, or some science, looking at some actual historical examples, right? If this was only a case that was relevant for one example of early modern astronomy, it would seem like limited wider philosophical relevance. So when we first gave this talk, it was suggested to us that Heinrich Hertz's experiments to show the existence of electromagnetic waves might also fit the pattern, and we think it does. So Hertz was doing these experiments in a basement and didn't have complete control over the different phenomena. He was really trying to discern between the family of electromagnetic theories in which you could have electric waves in free air, and those waves were polarizable, with an earlier kind of family of electromagnetic theories in which electromagnetic phenomena was tied to particles that existed in materials, so it couldn't be propagated. And he observed not just electromagnetic waves, or his observations he took to be evidence not just for electromagnetic waves, but for polarizability of electromagnetic waves. Particularly, he had a device that basically was a spark gap transmitter of electric waves, and a receiver that also created a spark. And he found that it was only when they had the right orientation that the two would kind of, that you'd have a receiver and you'd have a sparker and receiver kind of connected. And so this phenomena is essentially, the dependence upon the phenomena, upon the orientation, is essentially inexplicable without the existence of the phenomena, because it requires a particular type of correlation, which is explained by the existence of polarized electric waves, but otherwise essentially inexplicable. And so in this case, it was clear at the time that not only did he not fully understand the experimental setup, but something had to be pathological, because the experimental results were actually inconsistent with all known theory. They actually implied that electromagnetic waves move 1.5 times faster in air than in wire, which is certainly not true. And so people at the time really did know or expect that something had gone wrong, but they nevertheless took the experiment to be kind of a demonstration of the existence of electromagnetic waves. And I think we claim that our reconstruction of epistemology allows us to understand the kind of inferential situation of the scientists themselves. So there was at the time poor understanding of the factors that might influence the correct function of Hertz's apparatus, but there was no causal mechanism through which experimental artifacts might generate a positive experimental report. The scientists were confident making inferences based upon a result despite their inconsistent nature, and we think that artifact asymmetry explains why. So before I hand over to Samir, and Samir will talk about 2 more case studies, one which is directly supporting and one which is interestingly more complicated, it's just useful just for a sanity check to think about an experiment where you don't have this situation. We really aren't claiming this is a generic situation. We're claiming it's a special situation, a certain observation, certain structure of observations. So, I mean, one of the most famous experiments ever, most famous null experiment ever probably, is the Michelson-Morley experiment. And so the Michelson-Morley experiment is had to be incredibly high precision. And so it's basically a bit like LIGO. It's an interferometer, so you have like light being bounced off mirrors. And the crucial thing about the experiment is that if there was an ether, you would find a differential travel time along one arm of the apparatus compared to the other. And so for a fully functioning apparatus, when the ether exists, you would see the effects of the differential travel time in a shift in the interference fringe. But as Michelson himself points out in the paper, and is quite kind of clear from understanding the physics of the situation, there are loads of things, nothing to do with the ether, that would cause an interference shift. In particular, because it's about the length, or one factor affecting the travel time is the length of the arms. Any kind of differential mechanical disturbance or temperature disturbance in the arms will also produce an interference fringe. And so there is a good reason to think that if the apparatus is not fully reliable, whether or not the ether exists is not really the kind of dominant factor that will lead to the positive observational report. There are clear identified mechanisms in which an experimental artifact could produce a positive observational report. So the artifact asymmetry conditions certainly don't obtain in this case. Right, I'm going to hand over to Samir. Sorry. No.
Okay, thanks, Karim. What I'm going to do is run through two examples from the history of 20th century biology, one from molecular biology, one from cell biology, and map them onto the framework and see whether the artifact asymmetry conditions that Karim has explained attain or not, and how much explanatory power our analysis does or doesn't have in these cases. The first one is an experiment that was done at Caltech in 1958 by two young postdocs there called Messelson and Stahl. This has been described as the most beautiful experiment in biology, and indeed is widely cited as an example, a rare example of a crucial experiment that really does settle the issue between competing hypotheses. In this case, the hypotheses in question concern how DNA replicates. So we're going way back. This is the early days of molecular biology. Watson and Crick, 1953, had shown the double helix, that DNA has this double helical structure. But what wasn't understood back at this time was how DNA replicates. And indeed, there were three hypothetical mechanisms that had been proposed. One claimed that what happens is that the entire DNA molecule, the entire double helix, is used as a template for building a daughter molecule. So it remains intact during replication. The daughter molecule is entirely built from new components. That was the so-called conservative replication mechanism. The alternative advocated by Francis Crick in particular was termed semi-conservative replication. And that posited that during DNA replication, the double helix uncoils, and each strand is then used as a template for synthesizing the daughter strand. So that means basically that the two daughter molecules would each contain one parental strand and one newly synthesized strand. And then the third mechanism advocated by Max Delbruck in particular was called the dispersive mechanism, which maintained that daughter molecules contain segments of, that each strand contains segments of parental and newly synthesized DNA dispersed with each other. So in any case, this was what they were trying to decide between. And what Messelson and Stahl did is design a very ingenious experiment to try and settle this issue. So what they did is they started with some E. coli, and they grew them in a medium, this bacteria, they grew them in a medium containing heavy nitrogen isotopes for a number of generations. What will happen then is that as the bacterial cells divide, and each time the bacterial cells divide, the DNA divides, or replicates rather. So then the DNA is going to incorporate those heavy bases. The bacteria are going to incorporate the heavy bases into their DNA. So firstly, they did that, ensuring that the DNA contained heavy nitrogen isotopes. And then they removed some of the E. coli and put them in a medium containing ordinary light nitrogen isotopes. And left them there for about 20 minutes, exactly the time required for one cell division, one round of DNA replication. And then extracted the DNA, loaded it up onto a cesium chloride solution, and put it in this device here, which is a so-called analytical ultracentrifuge that whizzes it around at high speed and generates a density gradient. And the position that the DNA floats at in that gradient, once it's been whizzed around, indicates the density of the DNA. And essentially, they found that this DNA, that had grown purely in the heavy medium, was all floated at one position. But after one cell generation, after the 20 minutes in the lighter medium, the band was at this intermediate position. But if you left it in the lighter medium for a bit longer, then all of the DNA would eventually contain the lighter nitrogen isotope, and so then it would get lighter and lighter, thus essentially settling the debate in favor of the semi-conservative model. They had precisely shown that the only way you could get what they thought you could get these results was if indeed the semi-conservative mechanism was true, and the intermediate band found was precisely a reflection of the fact that the DNA molecules were hybrids, each containing one parental strand with the heavy isotope, one newly synthesized strand with the light isotope, and hence the overall density would be intermediate between the heavy and the light. And that was indeed widely taken by the scientific community as settling the issue in favor of the semi-conservative model. Now, as ever, some, historians or philosophers have sort of said, look, was this really a crucial experiment? So you can imagine how you could have a debate about that. But in short, yeah, that's how it was seen. And what we claim here, again, following Franklin, is that this is a nice example, in fact, of artifact asymmetry. So to map it onto the framework that Karim laid out, that the observation is simply the fact that three discrete bands of DNA molecules are observed at different points, different bands in different positions in the ultracentrifuge. P, the phenomenon existing, says that DNA replication is indeed semi-conservative. And V, the statement that the apparatus is reliable, says that ultracentrifugation does indeed produce a density gradient. Now, that was reasonably well understood at the time. So it's plausible to say the probability of V was sort of more than a half, but not one, because it wasn't entirely clear that all of the conditions you need to separate to really decide between these three hypotheses were in fact met. There are some subtleties there. So certainly it wasn't a case where you could be 100% certain in the reliability of your apparatus for the task at hand. But on the other hand, there was the principles, the physical principles by which ultracentrifuges worked were reasonably well understood. So in short, the argument that Meselson and Stahl made as reconstructed by Franklin is essentially to say that it's not plausible that a malfunction of the apparatus could have generated the observations in question. So as Franklin puts it by saying it's difficult to imagine either an apparatus malfunction or a source of experimental background that could reproduce the experimental results. That's to say, unless DNA replication is indeed semi-conservative. So we again have the conditional on the assumption that the apparatus isn't entirely reliable. The probability of getting the positive observational report is much greater on the supposition that DNA replication is semi-conservative than if it isn't. So that's the crucial A much greater than B condition, which again represents the epistemic position of the scientists, given their sort of background assumptions about the plausible ways in which the apparatus might fail to be fully reliable, and the plausible mechanisms that might produce these three discrete bands in the ultracentrifuge. So Franklin goes on to say that this is similar to Galileo's observation of the moons of Jupiter, and I think that's right. He argues, quote, that the Meselson-Stahl observations showed both that the experimental apparatus was working properly and that the results obtained were correct. So again, he's claiming this dual role for the observations. They both give you reason to think that the phenomenon exists, that semi-conservative DNA replication occurs, and that your apparatus is working. Somewhat, again, counterintuitively, as Karim has said, because there is this counterintuition often articulated in philosophy of experiment where people say, you need to know that your apparatus works beforehand, before you can learn about the phenomenon. And in this sort of case, in this very special epistemic position that we claim obtains here, then that's in fact not true. That the one and the same set of observations can strongly confirm the hypothesis that the phenomenon exists that you're interested in, and give you reason to believe that your apparatus is working properly, or at least increase the probability of that. Okay, so that's that case. Second case, very, very, very different, and this concerns a rather notorious, embarrassing incident, really, in biology. Between about 1960 and 1980, a lot of biologists believed in this entity they're called the mesosome, which was an intracellular organelle, a bit like a mitochondria, that you would observe in many species of cells in microbes in particular. And it was sort of observed near the septum of the dividing cell, the point where the cell divides. So they assumed it had something to do with cell wall synthesis, in short. And this was detected by means of electron microscopy. And the experimental protocol basically involved getting a biological sample, passing an electron beam through it to generate an image on a photographic or a fluorescent plate. And now, in order to do that, you have to prepare the sample very carefully. It's got to be extremely thin. You have to fixate it chemically to stop it decaying. And it's, great care is needed. And it's also possible that the electron beam itself, the radiation from the electron beam, would just mess it up. And they knew all this at the time. But nonetheless, the scientists were convinced that they had observed the mesosome, and experiment after experiment found this interesting particle. They had journals devoted to it, conferences about, the hypotheses about the function of the mesosome. What's it all about? And again, this is a case where at the time they reasoned precisely that, although you couldn't be certain that your apparatus wasn't generating some sort of problem. The chance of seeing something reliably again and again and again at the same point in a cell under all these different experimental conditions was extremely small unless it actually existed. So again, they thought it couldn't possibly be an experimental artifact, despite the potential for the experimental treatment to mess it all up. The situation changed radically by the 1980s when new superior chemical fixation techniques came on hand. And it turned out that what they thought was the mesosome was in fact an artifact produced by the previous fixation techniques. And it's interesting, when these new techniques came on hand, one of the first arguments people made was, they can't be any good because they don't enable us to see the mesosome. But it turned out those were good, those later techniques, and the mesosome didn't exist. It was a pure experimental artifact. There is no such intracellular organelle. And so essentially what we claim here in this case is that in the original epistemic position, people thought the probability is the epistemic probability of the scientists at the time, did indeed satisfy the A much greater than B condition. They thought, even on the assumption the apparatus isn't entirely reliable, chance that you're going to get this observation is much greater on the supposition that the mesosome exists than that it doesn't. But later on, they came to think, no, in fact, it is an artifact. It was an artifact back then. So it's essentially to say that in the light of their enhanced background knowledge, they reevaluated these two conditional probabilities, and they thought them to be roughly equal. That doesn't actually make any difference whether the mesosome exists or not to the probability of getting this observational report if the apparatus is not reliable as it wasn't. Okay, so we claim then that the inferential structure here, or probabilistic structure, started off being like the Jupiter-Moons cases, but then over time, as background knowledge increased and changed, became more like the Michelson-Morley case. So the artifact asymmetry condition satisfied at one time, not at another. Not later on, illustrating the dependence on background knowledge. Okay. So that's that. Now, quickly want to talk about the broader implications of this view. This will only take 5 minutes, and to relate the analysis we've done to some other stuff in the literature. So Harry Collins coined this notorious expression, the experimentus regress, in which he claimed that there's a sort of deep epistemological problem about scientific experiment that isn't just meant to be the problem of induction, but it's something specific to experimental knowledge, where, as he describes it, then you have to have sort of prior knowledge that your apparatus works before you can use it to reliably find out anything about the world. But the only knowledge you can get that your apparatus reliably works comes from finding knowledge, so from using it to learn about the world. So there's a kind of circle there. regress or something like that. You can't gain, there's no any claims of getting independent evidence that your scientific apparatus is reliable. One obvious response and standard response to that is to say, no, look, yeah, there is usually. I mean, you calibrate your apparatus on one system. And then when you've done that, you then use it, knowledge that it's well calibrated, to study something else. So you precisely can get this independent evidence. Now, that's a valid point, I think, that point about independent calibration. But the thing is, one thing to note is that calibration isn't always possible. And so we take the artifact asymmetry point that we've been making to provide a sort of different way in which you might respond to this experimenter's regress situation by showing that under these very specific epistemic assumptions, one and the same set of observations can actually both confirm the existence of the phenomenon you're trying to observe and give you additional reason to think that your apparatus works. Bootstrapping in early science, the general idea of bootstrapping, a sort of self-starting iterative process that enables you to claw your way up by your own bootstraps. I mean, this plausibly describes the artifact asymmetry case. So again, if you think of the Galileo telescope case, then, I mean, one way of reconstructing the history of that, not too far from the truth, I think, is that, I mean, Galileo appealed to this artifact asymmetry to justify the hypothesis that Jupiter has moons and to demonstrate the reliability of his telescope to the skeptics. And he then went on to be able to adduce evidence for Copernicanism, such as the phases of Venus. And the interesting thing is that the phases of Venus, those arguably don't satisfy the artifact asymmetry conditions, in that it is pretty plausible that if the telescope isn't working completely reliably, it's going to distort the shape of stuff, shape of things. It's just what malfunctioning telescopes do. So in this case, the artifact asymmetry argument doesn't work so well, unlike in the Jupiter's moons case. But by the time Galileo came to this, he already had evidence that the telescope worked pretty well, that he got from using it to observe Jupiter's moons. So you see why we say there's a sort of nice bootstrapping that can be done. You start with a case where artifact asymmetry holds, use that to get evidence that your apparatus works, and then on the assumption your apparatus works, use it to observe other stuff, and thereby to learn even more. And it sounds too good to be true, but of course there are, inbuilt bits of background knowledge. And just finally then to point out some limitations of this. Firstly, although we do think the point about artifact asymmetry disproves Collins' claims about an unavoidable circularity affecting all experimental science. I mean, it's not to say it solves the problem of induction or anything like that. The second is that it's a defeasible mode of reasoning, and the example of the mesosome illustrates that you may be wrong about, you may think that A is much greater than B, but you're wrong. I mean, it may not be a correct or rational assumption to make. And thirdly, I mean, it's all contingent on getting a positive observational report. I mean, if you get, if Galileo hadn't seen anything, he looked down his telescope, obviously that wouldn't help much. But it's interesting to note then that in that particular case, under the assumptions of our model, the disconfirmation in question may be negligible, and that's to be seen by comparing the Bayes factors for O and not O. When the artifact asymmetry conditions obtain. That's just another way of saying, look, if Galileo hadn't observed anything, if you just look down the telescope, there's nothing there. There's no spots of light looking around in orbits, then that would tell him rather little about whether or not Jupiter has moons. And then finally, as the point Karim is emphasizing, the relevance of this is most pronounced when the prior probability of the experimental apparatus being fully reliable is not too high. So in a modern experimental physics situation, particularly, for example, where huge effort is put into ensuring that the apparatus is highly reliable, this phenomenon of artifact asymmetry is less relevant. most relevant in earlier stages of science or earlier stages of investigation, where you're not too sure about the reliability of your apparatus, because as the probability of V gets higher and higher, the difference between A and B comes to have less and less of an effect, as Karim showed with that, with that graph. Okay, and that's all. Thanks, guys.